Welcome back to another one of your flipped lectures. In today's flip lecture, we're going to talk about the start of the Great Depression and how the greatest economic disaster of the 21st century comes about. Here's a photo of the New York Stock Exchange in the 1920s. The New York Stock Exchange grew rapidly around the turn of the century as more and more Americans began getting involved in the buying and selling of stocks. And what happens in the 1920s is that a lot of ordinary Americans are going to start to invest in the stock market. And as a result of that, because more people buying stocks means more demand, the stock market value is going to rise. That means that the price of all the stocks in the stock market are going to increase. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The first is just optimism. People bought stocks because they thought that they could make money. The economy was doing well, there was a lot of new products being sold, and so people were optimistic about the future. There were also new loans available, and large amounts of loans, what is known as easy money. So a lot of people who could not afford to get into the stock market were now able to buy stocks. And ultimately, the idea of buying on margin allowed even more people to get involved in investing in the 1920s. If you bought on margin, you could buy a stock with actually only 10% of the cash you needed to buy a stock, and somebody would lend you the other 90%. However, these stocks bought on margin were subject to what is known as a margin call, where the person who lent the money, the broker, could demand repayment almost immediately. And in order to try to pay back the person their money, the one who had borrowed the money would be forced to sell their stock quickly in order to pay back their loan. There was also a lot of speculation going on during this time in the stock market. And speculation is going to artificially drive up prices of stock. We've talked about speculation many times, but this is the idea that you believe that a stock is going to increase in value, and so you buy it with the intention of selling it quickly. However, if enough people speculate, this will drive up prices and create a bubble that will eventually burst. Again, we've talked about this many times, I just wanted to review it. But before the crash even happened, the Great Depression was arguably already underway. And before the crash, there was a couple of things that began to show signs of economic trouble. The first was the idea of credit. Too many people had taken on too much debt during the 1920s in order to pay for excesses, things they couldn't afford, and all of this credit created a bubble, because it was going to be very difficult to pay back all of this money that had been spent. Also, manufacturers' goods sales began to slump. That means that they were selling less. And this is because demand is finally going down. After kind of all this spending, eventually people don't need to buy more than one or two cars, etc. And so there will be overproduction. And when there is overproduction, this means that companies don't need to hire more people to create things, and so massive layoffs at these companies began, making it even more difficult for a lot of people to pay back their debts. So there were a couple of cracks in the financial dam that started to basically show before the crash in 1929. Most people believe that there had been too much credit and too much consumption, and smart investors began to realize that the good times were possibly over. And also the idea of buying stock on margin led to margin calls potentially causing a problem. Because if people feared that they weren't going to have their loans paid back, a large number of lenders could all call in their margin loans at the same time. And if a bunch of people are forced to sell their stock because of margin calls, that is going to drive prices down, as it is going to increase supply and lower demand. So right before the stock market crashed, a giant storm starts to gather around Wall Street. The first piece of this is that the recession had begun. There was a decline in sales, and so investors weren't as confident in the booming economy as they had been. And people start to get nervous that they're going to lose money, which leads to people panicking and trying to sell their stock off all at once. Also, those manufactured goods, all the sales began to slump, meaning that companies were making less money than they were before, leading investors to believe that stock prices were going to fall. There were also unsubstantiated rumors about large investors who were buying out of the market, which led the ordinary investors to start to get even more nervous. And then finally, most investors were afraid that a rapid decline could happen very, very quickly. And so all this gathered up to cause the stock market crash in 1929. So on October 24th of 1929, a day known as Black Thursday, the stock market began to crash. And by the next week, Black Tuesday, October 29th, the stock market had gone into free fall. What happened on Black Thursday was panic. And panic exactly how you understand the word panic, where nervous investors began to start to sell stocks. And once a large number of investors sold stock, they triggered a massive attempt by a large number of people to sell off all their stocks in order to make back their money. But all this led to the flooding of supply and low demand, which led to the prices of stock plummeting. As a result of these plummeting prices, lenders basically decided to call in all their margin loans. So a large number of margin calls led to even more people having to sell their stocks. And the result at the end of those 5 days was that $30 billion were lost in 1929, which was about as much money as Americans were paid and earned in wages in 1929. So essentially, the crash wiped out an entire year of prosperity in the United States. Here's a New York Times headline that basically is documenting that the stocks are going to plunge 22.6% in just one day. Here is a graph that's going to show you how rapidly the stock market declined in 1929, especially on Black Tuesday. As you can see, the value spiked in 1929 and then crashed all the way down to the market low in 1932. So the United States would now begin a massive economic slide into what we call the Great Depression, or further into what we call the Great Depression. And a couple of people were hit very hard by this crash and by the start of this Great Depression. And the people who were hit the hardest were the margin buyers, those who had basically borrowed large amounts of money to buy stocks. Because when those stocks failed, people lost their entire life savings, and a lot of people went into debt because they were unable to actually pay back all the money they had borrowed to buy stock. Next, the banks would fall. And the question is, why did a stock market crash hurt banks? And the reasons are these. First off, the banks had invested heavily in the stock market. So when the stock market crashed, it caused the banks to lose a lot of money in investments. Also, loans paid out to individuals and businesses would not be paid back. They could not be paid back after so much wealth had been lost in the stock market. And so as a result, the banks are going to lose money. And many are going to be actually forced to close their doors by the end of the Great Depression. Again, if we look at this money cycle, you see how any one part of this money cycle is going to trigger a chain reaction that's going to affect all the other aspects of the economy. Another thing that hurt banks are what is known as a bank run. And what a bank run is almost exactly like it sounds, where large numbers of people actually run to the bank to demand their money out of the bank. And so what happens is that people deposit money in a bank, but the bank doesn't keep all the currency on hand in the bank. The idea is that most people only need a little bit of their money at any given time. But if everybody tries to get all of their money at once, the bank is simply going to run out of money. And when a bank runs out of money, they have to declare bankruptcy. And before the Great Depression, there were no laws about this. And so if a bank went bankrupt, all the people who had deposited money in that bank simply lost all of their money that they had in that bank. So even people who weren't in the stock market and weren't speculating and didn't take out big loans, they would still lose their money, and some people lost their entire life savings right after the stock market crash in 1929. So the final toll after the stock market had crashed is that somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 banks are going to collapse in a very short period after 1929. The massive layoffs associated with both the overproduction and the stock market crash forcing businesses to both shut their doors and cut their hours are going to lead to massive layoffs, which mean unemployment. And actually unemployment is going to climb as high as 25%, 1 in 4 people, by 1933. And those who were lucky enough to still have jobs saw their wages cut substantially. And ultimately, the United States gross national product, the total value of things in the United States, would fall by about half from $103.1 billion in 1929 to just $55.6 billion in 1933. This was an economic disaster of massive proportions. So we got to ask ourselves, what the heck just happened with this Great Depression? And in fact, many economists have been trying to answer this question ever since it happened in the late 1920s and 1930s. So let's look at a couple of possible answers. We talked about economics in our last unit, but now we're going to talk about a couple of economic theories having to do with the Great Depression. And there are three main theories that try to explain how the Great Depression happened. The first is known as the Keynesian theory, named after the economist John Maynard Keynes. The monetarist theory, which basically deals with currency, their primary proponents are Milton Friedman and F.A. Hayek. And then finally, John Kenneth Galbraith, an economist, also tried to come up with his own theory that has become quite popular since he published his book. Let's start first with the Keynesian theory. And Keynesianism is going to be very popular in the United States, both right after the Great Depression started, with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal, but also with the United States throughout the rest of modern history. Lyndon Baines Johnson's Great Society is actually derived from the idea of Keynesianism. And so let's look at what John Maynard Keynes had to say about what caused the Great Depression. And Keynesianism says that the cause of any recession or depression in an economy is simply the lack of demand. The idea is that the lack of demand, not enough people buying things, and not enough demand for products and goods, stops the flow of the money cycle, which leads to recession. And so Keynesianism's solution to a bad economy is to restart the flow of the money cycle. But you may be asking yourself, well, how can you simply increase demand? And Keynesianism says that the organization that can always create more demand is the government. So Keynesianism says that the government should spend more money, which is what's known as a stimulus, remember Barack Obama, to increase demand and lower taxes so that people spend more money. The idea is that the government can spend a lot of money. They can build new roads, they can order hot chips for all of their employees, and the government can create demand. And the government can also collect less taxes. And if the government collects less taxes, then basically people will have more money in their pocket to spend. But all of this is what is known as deficit spending. Because in order for the government to spend more money and collect less money in taxes, the government will have to spend more money than it has. So the idea of Keynesianism is that in bad times, you basically take on a lot of debt by deficit spending, and then in good times, you raise taxes and you pay off the debt you accumulated during the bad time. However, this almost never happens, hence why we have such a big national debt today. But Keynesianism also says that the second piece of this puzzle is to lower interest rates. Because if interest rates are lowered, then the money supply will increase. Remember the Federal Reserve? And so the idea is that if you can encourage borrowing and spending, then it will start the money cycle once again. So Keynesianism is all about the money cycle, the flow of money, and the solution they offer is for the government to spend more to increase demand, and for interest rates to be lowered so that more people will borrow money and spend it, thus getting the economy moving again. However, not everybody agrees with Keynesianism, and not everybody agrees that this is how you solve economic problems. The monetarists also have their own theory about how the Great Depression happened and what the government should have done. And the monetarists basically say that things like the start of the Great Depression at the end of the 20s and the stock market crash are all part of a normal cycle of boom and bust. The idea is that the economy expands and then the economy gets too big. So the idea is that the boom time, which was the early 1920s, would always naturally be followed by the bust time, which would be the early Great Depression. But the idea is that overproduction and overexpansion will always lead to recession because the economy had gotten too big, so it has to shrink again, and then the economy will always recover on its own. And monetarists believe that government interference, either from the actual government or from the Federal Reserve System, will always make recessions longer because it will interrupt the natural cycle of economic boom and bust. So the solution that the monetarists advocate is that the government should not interfere, that the economy should always have free markets because the belief is that free markets will always even out. And the idea is that they should also have the Federal Reserve make sure that the money supply is under control. And the idea is that if there is too much money, that will cause rapid inflation, which will hurt the recovery. And if deflation happens, then the exact same thing will happen. So to the monetarists, the right thing to do is just to let the normal boom and bust cycle of the economy take over and realize that for every good time, there is going to be a time of recession. The last theory was created by an economist named John Kenneth Galbraith. And Galbraith's theory is neither Keynesian nor monetarist. Galbraith's theory is that basically the recession of 1929 turns into the Great Depression because of a perfect storm of specific flaws that are in the United States economic system. So his theory is that the recession started as a normal inventory recession, the idea that there was too much production and there were low sales, and that these normal recessions happen all the time. But what Galbraith says is that the Great Depression becomes the Great Depression because of specific flaws in the United States economic system that allowed it to get from bad to worse. And so Galbraith's solution is for the government to make very specific laws and regulations to address those very specific problems. And here are the flaws that Galbraith identified. He identified 4 large problems. The first problem was the unequal distribution of income. And in the 1920s, the top 3% of people earned 33% of all of the income. The idea of this is that not enough people have money to spend, and so there is not enough demand. The idea is that Bill Gates can only buy enough food and clothing for Bill Gates, and the economy relies on a large number of people buying products. But if they don't have the money to do that, then that's going to cause economic problems and the lack of demand. Galbraith also identified the banking structures that were in place in the United States, and he said that they were problematic. The first piece is that large loans between banks were in fact allowed. So, for example, Chase Bank could loan $1 million to BMO Harris Bank, but the problem with that is then the problems of weak banks would spread to the strong banks. Because if Chase Bank lent money to another bank and that bank collapsed, then Chase Bank is not getting back the money that it lent out to the other bank. So this meant that all the problems that were encountered by the weak banks are going to spread to other banks like a disease. He also said that banks were allowed to overinvest in risky stocks. And if banks invest in risky stocks and lose, then they're going to lose money. Also, there was no law or provision or protection against the bank runs, which caused a lot of these banks to end up having to declare bankruptcy. And so ultimately, these 3 things led to the bank failures triggering a chain reaction that would ripple through the entire United States banking system. And so, John Kenneth Galbraith believed that the bad banking structures also led to the Great Depression. Then he said that there was a bad corporate structure in the United States, and that holding companies that own other companies, ended up spreading the problems of these failing companies to other companies that were unrelated. And so the idea was that these bad corporate structures linked strong businesses with weak businesses, and it led to a domino effect, much like the banking structures, where if any one business failed, other businesses would have to be affected. And then ultimately, Galbraith believed that the high tariffs that the United States had on imported goods restricted foreign trade and led to an even bigger sales slump, which helped the Great Depression get even worse. So Galbraith's theory is a little bit more complex and a little bit less theoretical, and he points at specific things that were in place that really, he believed, caused this Great Depression. But regardless of what actually caused the Great Depression, and again, nobody agrees on these things, it was certain that by the end of 1929, the Great Depression was underway in the United States.